Hello, welcome to this video. I am all set up, I got my gear set up, I have my hot cocoa drink, not to be confused with cacao. Actually, it was cacao I was drinking, not cocoa, so that was pretty ironic for me to say. Anyway, and I have my book Dubliners, which I got from Books Upstairs in Dublin, and I'll be doing a book review on this. So, I spent a few days in Dublin during December 2022. It's a very beautiful city, full of cheery vibes. I was able to see a James Joyce statue, and I picked up this book, Dubliners, from a bookstore called Books Upstairs in Dublin, and I had the chance to read it over the holidays, over and over. I read some of the stories when I was younger, but I was like 21 at the time, and most of the stories, like the messages flew over me, and I found it quite like boring. But now, like after a reread, being more mature, I'm 25 now, they hit different, and I'm gonna get into this. And obviously this review has spoilers. Obviously, we take different things from the same books based on our own personal experiences, and what I say will purely be, or mostly, my interpretation of things. They could be wrong, they could be unintended to come off the way I interpreted them, and I'll provide my interpretation and experience of things anyway. Some of the stories have left like a deep impact on me, and some I don't really have much to say about. After I upload this video though, I'm going to do like a deeper dive and look at the experts' analyses and see what they have to say about these stories, because it seems some of the things probably have blown over my head. But for now, I'm just going to talk about like how it is to me. So the reason why I like James Joyce, relevant to this book review, is that he wrote honestly, and he wanted to depict what people in Dublin were like for real during his time. He didn't care to dress up his stories into something grand, dramatic, or entertaining. He wanted to write things as they really were. And I love that honesty. I don't really read the introduction for books, but this one felt important. And also I was on a plane ride from Dublin back to Canada, so might as well. First of all, we get insight on what Joyce's character is like here. Quote, "For in the midst of trauma, alcoholism, familial violence, and disintegration, Joyce maintained a cheerful resolution of temperament, which came from sources of self-belief that could not be shaken by the storms which raged about him." And then the intro goes into more context behind how the stories were written in relation to Joyce's character. This text, like all of Joyce's work, contains autobiographical matter and is rooted in an intensely accurate apprehension of the detail of the Dublin life Joyce had observed all about him as he grew to adulthood. His instinct was for truth of life as he saw it, and his moral engagement involved him in a search for modes of artistic expression which would serve that truth, whatever the consequences. It is clear that Joyce intended Dubliners, at the very least, to be a realist study of his native city, a work representative of Irish experience, conducted with Ibsenite moral rigor. These stories, they seem like they're intended simply to depict things honestly, nothing else, like no fluff, you know? It offers fragments of human experience that may or may not amount to defining moments. I think that's a really good way to describe it, even though I think it's subjective what you see as a defining moment. But anyway, so the first story from this short story collection, Dubliners, is called The Sisters. And the story was difficult to understand at first, but to me, it's about this priest who passes away after having a bunch of health issues, who passes away after having a third stroke. And the story is told through the perspective of a young boy, and this boy hears conversations around him by adults regarding the death of this priest. And he doesn't understand everything they're saying because they're talking like adults, and there's this like maturity gap between him and these adults, and he's frustrated about that. It's like they're speaking in an adult language that they all can understand except for him, and he's frustrated by this gap in maturity. Though I was angry with old Cotter for alluding to me as a child, I puzzled my head to extract meaning from his unfinished sentences. Yeah, so when adults do talk to the boy feels that he's being spoken to as an immature, naive child when he believes that he can handle the adult talk. He goes into things as Uncle taught him that make him feel like a grown person. Like it's like his way of justifying that, yeah, I am mature. For example, he had taught me to pronounce Latin properly. He had told me stories about the catacombs and about Napoleon Bonaparte. And he had explained to me the meaning of the different ceremonies of the Mass and of the different vestments worn by the priest. His questions showed me how complex and mysterious were certain institutions of how the church, which I had always regarded as the simplest acts. What stood out to me as well about this story is that death doesn't always have to be dramatic, how it's not always some big, grand event for others surrounding it. The way it was told in the story, it felt mundane, like it was just another day. I found it strange that neither I nor the day seemed in a mourning mood, and I felt even annoyed at discovering in myself a sensation of freedom, as if I had been freed from something by his death. Most of the pages leading up to the ending are dialogue from the adults surrounding this boy, and he's just observing quietly, maybe trying to make sense of what they're saying. But there's definitely a cryptic aura to these conversations from the perspective of this boy. So the next story is an encounter, and again, it's a story about young boys. The story is about these boys who find out about the Wild West, and they enjoy reading stories on it and playing games inspired by it. For example, they have mock Indian battles. The main character through which we experience the story is super inspired by these tales and finds the stuff he and his friends read at school to be boring, like in contrast. The adults that surround these boys disapprove of this interest. "What is this rubbish?" he said. "The Apache chief? Is this what you read instead of studying your Roman history? Let me not find any more of this wretched stuff in this college." The narrator and his friends then decide to ditch school with excuses to read more Wild West stories and play, and they succeed in doing that. School and home seem to recede from us, and their influences upon us seem to wane. As they're playing, though, the strange man approaches them. He came along by the bank slowly. He walked with one hand upon his hip, and in the other hand he held a stick with which he tapped the turf lightly. He was shabbily dressed in a suit of greenish black and wore what we used to call a jerry hat with a high crown. You know when you're at the mall or you're just chilling outdoors in downtown, you're minding your own business and you get approached by some guy who's a bit loud and like talkative, and he tries to give you he tries to hit you, he tries to like talk to you, or like tries to even like give you a pamphlet related to like religion or something. That's like the vibe I got from this guy. He's just somebody who comes off like out of touch, a bit unhinged, and is quick to ramble on with like unsolicited, controversial opinions. And these boys, they play it cool until they find like a polite way to exit the conversation. The boy, the main character, he was also concerned with coming off unintelligent because this man was an adult, and it's probably because the boy wants to be viewed as an adult by other adults, and he wants to be viewed as mature, and it doesn't matter who. He said he had all Sir Walter Scott's works and all Lord Lytton's works. Of course, he said, there was some of Lord Lytton's works which boys couldn't read. Mahoney asked why couldn't boys read them, a question which agitated and pained me because I was afraid that the man would think I was as stupid as Mahoney. And I was penitent, for in my heart I had always despised him a little. And the rest of the story consists of the boys talking shit about the man when he's not in earshot, and the man continuing to talk to them and being strange. I fucking love cacao. Anyway, so the third story in the short story collection is called Araby. And this is a cute story that's madly gut-wrenching. It's yet again about a boy, and he has a crush on this girl, and this girl asks him if he's going to a bazaar called Araby. And the girl says that she can't go because she has a retreat that day. And the boy decides that he's going to go just so he can get her something from the bazaar. And in the end, the boy leaves with nothing and is frustrated. It is madly sad, and Joyce writes about crushes so beautifully. When she came out on the doorstep, my heart leaped. I kept her brown figure always in my eye. Her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood. You know, like youth, love, or adult even. We just kind of hide it when we're adults. Her name sprang to my lips at moments in strange pairs and praises which I myself did not understand. And that's how the story starts, just talking about his crush and describing it. How he perceives this girl. And then it gets into the topic of the bazaar. "And why can't you go to Araby?" I asked. "Because there would be a retreat. If I go," I said, "I will bring you something." One notable thing was when the narrator was at a dining table with adults, and he writes, "I had to endure the gossip of the tea table." I found that pretty funny. I mean, I feel like that's relatable, right? So then this boy is at the bazaar, and he's on this mission to fetch something to bring back, and he received a florin from his uncle, which is like 75 cents in Canadian dollars today. And it was considered a lot. It was considered a lot of money back then. He's all charged up, but he seems to be the only one in this sort of like mindset in this mode. Everyone else is just business as usual. It's just a normal day. He's visiting stalls trying to find something, and he gets frustrated and ultimately fails. Remembering with difficulty why I had come, I went over to one of the stalls and examined porcelain vases and flowered tea sets. Observing me, the young lady came over and asked me did I wish to buy anything. The tone of her voice was not encouraging. She seemed to have spoken to me out of a sense of duty. I looked humbly at the great jars that stood like eastern guards at either side of the dark entrance to the stall, and murmured, "No, thank you." Gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. That sucks, man. The boy took this trip, probably like a long trip, decently long, just to get his crush something, just to bring his crush back something, and he genuinely tries. He has a good heart, and he doesn't deliver. Okay, so the fourth story is Eveline, and this is one of the more popular stories in this collection, like amongst like people who like this book. I feel it's about this woman who feels trapped in her home city. So it's not. So we're like moving away from like youth and boys. Yeah. So this one's about a woman who feels trapped in her home city and the obligations and responsibilities that come with living in her hometown. She has this opportunity, though, to get away with a lover, like on a ferry boat to Buenos Aires. They would get married and basically start a new life. The thing is, she helps out with a family business, and she promised her diseased mother that she would take care of the household as long as she can. She has written goodbye letters to her brother and father, and she also had another brother who passed away. In the end, she doesn't take the opportunity, and the boat leaves in front of her, and she's just frozen. Just there as her lover cries out to her, trying to like get her on the boat, but the boat's like leaving, and it's too late. She set her white face to him, passive, like a helpless animal. Her eyes gave him no sign of love or farewell or recognition. It's a beautiful story. In life, we have to come across opportunities that are outside our comfort zone, but they would opportunities that would drastically change our lives. We'd have a lot to gain, but also a lot to lose, and making that decision can be very difficult. And it reminds me of this Dave Eggers quote from one of his short stories. How many times in life can we make decisions that are important but will not hurt anyone? It's a really sick short story, by the way. The next story is called After the Race. And I really didn't get the story the first read. To me, it comes off as about having reckless fun, being reckless with money, playing cards, and losing a lot of money, but being able to afford it in the end. I don't have much to say about this. That's literally all I have to say. The sixth story is called Two Gallants. I'm not sure how to pronounce that really. But the story is about friends who are in their early 30s, and one of them, the main character that the story follows, he feels stuck in life. And he spends his time walking around the city with friends, getting into random small adventures, and going to pubs. This character's name is Lenihan. He's like that one friend you invite to parties and social gatherings, and he like brightens up the mood and he's fun to be with, but you wouldn't like you have a good time with him, but you wouldn't necessarily like confide in him for like deep personal shit, or you wouldn't rely on him, or you wouldn't have like a one-on-one chat with him in a cafe and have like life chats, you know? He's just like a fun friend to be with. He's not the most responsible either, and sometimes he may ask you to cover expenses for him, like food or whatever, like Uber rides, I don't know. Most people considered Lenihan a leech, but in spite of his reputation, his adroitness and eloquence had always prevented his friends from forming any general policy against him. He had a brave manner of coming up to a party of them in a bar and holding himself nimbly at the borders of the company until he was included in a round. No one knew how he achieved the stern task of living. You know, like sometimes you see people who are your age, like adults, and they don't seem the most organized or put together, and you're wondering how they live, how they get by. Lenihan's like, that's what he is to me. So Lenihan has his friend named Corley, and they're outside in the city, and Corley's talking about this woman he had like a connection with, and this woman's like a maid. She works as a maid, and Lenihan is doubting what Corley's saying, and they spot her in the streets as Lenihan and Corley are chatting. At the corner of Hume Street, a young woman was standing. She wore a blue dress and a white sailor hat. I'm not sure about the significance of this, but I saw in the footnote that blue and white represents the colors, like it's associated with like these colors, blue and white, they're associated with the Virgin Mary in Catholic tradition. Lenihan wants to take a closer look at her, so Corley's like, okay, I'm going to talk to her, and you're going to like walk past me and just get a good look at her, and I'm just going to keep talking to her. And then they agreed that they're going to meet up after Corley talks to this girl. So Corley and the woman, they end up going for a walk, and it ends up being really long. So Lenihan is like left to himself, kind of like following them, stalking them, and he ends up losing time. He settles at a shop to eat to pass the time, and Lenihan comes off as a guy who constantly distracts himself with shallow fun and entertainment, mostly by including himself in others' businesses and lives, so that he's too distracted to think about like serious serious shit or make progress with his life. The problem of how he could pass the hours till he met Corley again troubled him a little. He could think of no way of passing them but to keep on walking. The girl brought him a plate of hot grocer's peas, seasoned with pepper and vinegar, a fork, and his ginger beer. He ate his food greedily and found it so good that he made a note of the shop mentally. When he had eaten all the peas, he sipped his ginger beer and sat for some time, thinking of Corley's adventure. In his imagination, he blended the pair of lovers walking along some dark road. He heard Corley's voice in deep, energetic gallantries, and saw again the leer of the young woman's mouth. This vision made him feel keenly of his own poverty, of purse and spirit. He was tired of knocking about, of pulling the devil by the tail, of shifts and intrigues. And there's a footnote that explains that pulling the devil by the tail is slang for being on the brink of financial catastrophe. He would be 31 in November. Would he never get a good job? Would he never have a home of his own? He thought how pleasant it would be to have a warm fire to sit by and a good dinner to sit down to. He had walked the streets long enough with friends and with girls. He might yet be able to settle down in some snug corner and live happily if he could only come across some good simple-minded girl with a little of the ready. A little of the ready is slang for having immediate access to significant funds, again, from a footnote. And I think that these quotes, or this quote here, supports the idea that Lenihan is a leech. Like, that's a good way to describe what he is. And that's how he thinks. In the end, Lenihan and Corley meet up again, and Corley has a gold coin in his palm. It's implied that the woman who remember, is a maid. She stole that gold coin from a servant and gave it to Corley. During my first read, I thought that because Lenihan was mentioned to be a leech, that Corley, it's like a normal thing in their friendship dynamic for Corley to give Lenihan things like that, like money. But yeah, that's the story. The next story after that is called The Boarding House. The story is about a woman, Mrs. Mooney, who runs a boarding house and cares for her young daughter, Polly. Polly gets into an affair with one of the adult guests in the boarding house, and the story follows the interactions between Polly and Mrs. Mooney as Mrs. Mooney unravels the situation. We also get a glimpse of the man with whom Polly was having an affair with, and he's referred to as Mr. Doran. He was 34 or 35 years of age, so that youth could not be pleaded as an excuse, nor could ignorance be his excuse, since he was a man who had seen something of the world. The story ends just before Polly and Mr. Doran meet up to discuss things and clear things up, and that's all I have to say about this story. Okay, so the next story is called A Little Cloud, and this was my favorite story, actually, when I first read this collection 4 years ago. It has stuck with me through the years, and sometimes I even reread it, but it's definitely one of the short stories that have impacted me the most in general, out of all the short stories I've read. So A Little Cloud is about two friends who meet up after 8 years, and one is successful and the other isn't. It stuck with me because I told myself that I never want to be that friend on that side who is unsuccessful. The successful friend, his name is Ignatius Gallagher, and the unsuccessful friend is named Little Chandler, or Tommy Chandler. Thomas Tommy Chandler. Gallagher is a well-traveled, charismatic guy who writes for a newspaper based in England called the London Press, and he is highly respected. There was always a certain something in Ignatius Gallagher that impressed you in spite of yourself. Even when he was out at elbows and at his wits' end for money, he kept up a bold face. Little Chandler remembered, and the remembrance brought a slight flush of pride to his cheek, one of Ignatius Gallagher's sayings when he was in a tight corner. "Half-time now, boys," he used to say lightheartedly. "Where's my considering cap?" That was Ignatius Gallagher all out, and damn it, you couldn't but admire him for it. I'm going to read some of the footnotes here to make this quote make more sense. Half-time is a phrase that means hold on a minute. Considering cap suggests the confident, clever attitude of Gallagher when he's having financial problems. And all out is a Hiberno English term that expresses admiration. Now, Little Chandler, in contrast, is a guy who stayed in Dublin most of his life. He daydreams about being a poet. He has a shelf full of poems, but hasn't taken any action towards it. Like, he has a shelf full of poetry books from poets he likes, but he hasn't taken any action towards this goal. He has a wife and child, and he has to take care of that. That takes up his time. Gallagher and Chandler, they meet up after 8 years, and Gallagher's like, "Tommy," he said, I see you haven't changed an atom." And to me, that would be such an insult, you're going through the years, especially me, I'm in my 20s. Imagine going through your years and not changing at all, and not improving or anything like that, or even regressing. So that I would take that as an insult, or as as like a sign that I would need to change or like reevaluate my life and or how like the direction it's going. I don't know, but like yeah, that's a striking quote, I'd say. So Gallagher starts talking about his travel experiences. You know, he's been around Paris, other places, and Tommy reveals that he has a wife and boy and invites Gallagher to meet them one evening. But Gallagher's like, oh man, I'm actually busy tonight. Sorry, I'm actually meeting another friend. And Tommy's like, what about tomorrow? And Gallagher's like, oh, I'm actually leaving tomorrow. And then Gallagher agrees that, okay, hey, next time I owe you a visit. I owe your family a visit, you know, like just playing it off nice, you know. Chandler starts comparing himself to Gallagher in his own head. He felt acutely the contrast between his own life and his friends, and it seemed to him unjust. Gallagher was his inferior in birth and education. He was sure that he could do something better than his friend had ever done, or could ever do. Something higher than mere tawdry journalism if he only got the chance. What was it that stood in his way? His unfortunate timidity. And then Gallagher starts talking about his future plans. I'm going to have my fling first and see a bit of life and the world before I put my head in the sack, if I ever do. And then later, the story shifts to Chandler being in his house, and we get a glimpse of what his household is like. He forgets to bring home coffee that he was supposed to get for his wife, Annie. So Annie's like, oh my god. Like, she's in a bitter mood, and she ends up going outside of the house to do it herself. The story goes into Chandler's annoyances with Annie, his spouse, how he once bought her an overpriced dress, and how he's looking at a photograph of her in it and wondering what led him to wanting to ever be with her. A dull resentment against his life awoke within him. Could he not escape from his little house? Was it too late for him to try to live bravely like Gallagher? Could he go to London? There was furniture still to be paid for. He starts reading poems, thinking about crafting his own, and then his child wakes up and starts crying, and Chandler feels interrupted by this. He tries to calm his crying child, but he fails. And then Annie steps in and is like, what did you do? To Chandler. And she successfully calms the baby down. The last line of the story is, he listened while the paroxysm of the child's sobbing grew less and less, and tears of remorse started to his eyes. So yeah, poor little Chandler. Personally, this story, it's good to not overthink, but I'd rather be like an overthinker about things than someone who just takes it easy and lays back and just watches life go through me, past me. So I'd rather have that problem of being an overthinker, and I do think a lot about like my next steps and my progress and like each day matters kind of thing. So yeah, and the story reinforces that. I also think that I don't think Chandler's life sucks. Like, it's how he perceives it. Like, I think having a wife and kid and not having traveled anywhere or having a poetry career, whatever, is fine. It just depends on you and how you see things. There's nothing wrong with his situation. It's his mindset towards it and how he compares himself to Gallagher in like a bad way. I personally don't understand that. Like, I prefer to like be happy for my friends when they succeed. It doesn't matter how their success is in relation to myself. So it's like a weird way. It's like a non-optimal way to perceive others. Yeah. Now the next story after that is called Counterparts. So the story is about a guy, Farrington, who is getting chewed on by his bosses at work, and he has like hidden resentment towards them. He's also financially struggling, and the story is just about a guy who has a bad day, basically. And it's like that song by Daniel Powder. I know nothing about any other two letters, he said stupidly. You know nothing. After work, Farrington goes to a bar, and he loses an arm wrestling match twice to like a really young guy. He was full of smoldering anger and revengefulness. He felt humiliated and discontented. He did not even feel drunk, and he had only 2 pence in his pocket. He cursed everything. He had done for himself in the office, pawned his watch, spent all his money, and he had not even got drunk. Tragic. He had lost his reputation as a strong man, having been defeated twice by a mere boy. His heart swelled with fury, and when he thought of the woman in the big hat who had brushed against him and said, "Pardon," his fury nearly choked him. In the end, he goes home and takes it out on his son, physically. I don't have much else to say about the story. It's just a bad day for a guy who doesn't take his anger out the most optimal. So the next story is called Clay, and it's about a woman named Maria who is setting up a social gathering, and she used to be in a relationship, but now maybe a marriage. But in the story, she's like a single woman, and she comes off as a kind, emphatic soul that a lot of people like and kind of rely on. She works at a laundromat, and she's also a plant mom. She was always sent for when the women quarreled over their tubs and always succeeded in making peace. So she's like the mother, she's like the mom in the friend group, basically, you know? The responsible one who can see things outside of, like, see everybody's perspective and take them into account and be, like, super understanding, basically. There's a guy named Joe who had disputes with his brother Alfie, but they used to get along and have good times together. And Maria took care of Joe and Alfie when they were kids, and as they grew up, and Joe sees Maria as like a mother figure. Mama is mama, but Maria is my proper mother. Joe comes off as cynical. He basically counters negativity with more negativity, and he's prideful of that. Like he's prideful of like his smart-ass answers to a boss he doesn't like, for example. He told her all that went on in his office, repeating for her a smart answer which he had made to the manager. Maria did not understand why Joe laughed so much over the answer he had made, but she said that the manager must have been a very overbearing person to deal with. I think this quote shows kindness on Maria's part. Like, she doesn't understand why someone would feel good about negativity. She doesn't have that bitterness that Joe does. It's contrasting, and at the same time, she shows understanding of Joe's perspective, gathering the fact that Joe's manager must be overbearing to work with. Just the contrast between the two characters, you know? The compassionate, understanding, kind, patient Maria, and like the cynical, easily angered Joe, let's say. There's also Maria's interactions with Mooney and Lizzie Fleming, and both are kind of urging Maria to like get married again, and Maria replies that she's not interested, and she thinks of Mooney and Lizzie Fleming as common women. She refers to Mooney as a dummy at one point. Lizzie Fleming said Maria was sure to get the ring. Maria had to laugh and say she didn't want any ring or man either. Then Ginger Mooney lifted up her mug of tea and proposed Maria's health, while all the other women clattered with their mugs on the table, and she said she was sorry she hadn't a sup of porter to drink it in. And Maria laughed again till the tip of her nose nearly met the tip of her chin, until her minute body nearly shook itself asunder, because she knew that Mooney meant well, though, of course, she had notions of a common woman. But wasn't Maria glad when the women had finished their tea and the cook and the dummy had begun to clear away the tea things? I think it was also implied that Maria wasn't an attractive-looking woman. Maria was a very, very small person indeed, but she had a very long nose and a very long chin. And like these features about her face get mentioned over and over throughout the story. Now there's another quote I want to read. Maria had never seen Joe so nice to her as he was that night, so full of pleasant talk and reminiscences. She said they were all very good to her. When I read this, I thought that this gathering was seen like as some sort of like wholesome escape from the rough lives of these guests. Like this is like a safe space for them, and the world is rough and cold. At the end of the story, Maria sings a tune called I Dreamt That I Dwelt, and Joe cries. Joe was very much moved, and his eyes filled up so much with tears that he could not find what he was looking for, and in the end he had to ask his wife to tell him what a corkscrew was. Okay, so I finished my cacao, and now I'm switching to this water I have. It's almost half full. But anyway, we'll continue. So, the next story is called A Painful Case. And when I first read the story, I was like, wow, the story is so gut-wrenching, and it's like extremely gut-wrenching, and it's my first favorite story now, instead of A Little Cloud. And I thought it was like the saddest story in Dubliners. But after a reread, I'm like, never mind. I thought the story was like a love story between a guy and a girl, but it's about like an affair. So when I found out the second read that it was an affair, I actually listened to like a Spotify audiobook thing, and yeah, that kind of ruined it for me. But it's still a good story. So we have the cynical and bitter guy, Mr. Duffy, and the first 3 pages are all you need to gain a sense of how deep his cynicism is. Mr. Duffy abhorred anything which betokened physical or mental disorder. His cheekbones also gave his face a harsh character, but there was no harshness in the eyes which, looking at the world from under their tawny eyebrows, gave the impression of a man ever alert to greet a redeeming instinct in others, but often disappointed. His liking for Mozart's music brought him sometimes to an opera or a concert. These were the only dissipations of his life. He had neither companions nor friends, church nor creed. He allowed himself to think that in certain circumstances he would rob his bank, but as these circumstances never arose, his life rolled out evenly, an adventureless tale. So yeah, Mr. Duffy is a cashier in a bank called he's a cashier in a bank in Bagot Street. He gets close with this woman and finds love, basically. He finds warm love, and he lets it go because he's scared that it'll fall. He's scared that it'll fail and it'll bring misery, so he cuts ties with her. He lent her books, provided her with ideas, and shared his intellectual life with her. She listened to all. So, sorry, like this is an old script before I read it twice. I'm reading off an old script, but he meets this girl, and he starts going over to this woman's house, and she's married, and the husband doesn't really think anything much of it because he's so like disillusioned or detached from his wife's desires that he thinks that this guy, that Mr. Duffy is actually trying to like woo his daughter. So like that's why the husband isn't suspicious. Her companionship was like a warm soil about an exotic. Many times she allowed the dark to fall upon them, refraining from lighting the lamp. The dark, discreet room, their isolation, the music that still vibrated in their ears united them. This union exalted him, wore away the rough edges of his character, emotionalized his mental life. He heard the strange, impersonal voice, which he recognized as his own, insisting on the soul's incurable loneliness. So yeah, they have to like hang out in the darkness, hang out discreetly because it's an affair. And then he cuts ties with her. They agree to break off their intercourse. Every bond, he said, is a bond to sorrow. What a very cynical guy. Very pessimistic guy. Like, who hurt this man? 4 years later, this woman appears in the news, and it's reported that she died in a train accident. And Mr. Duffy just regrets the fuck out of his decision in like cutting ties with her 4 years ago. He realized that she was dead, that she had ceased to exist, that she had become a memory. He walked through the bleak alleys where they had walked 4 years before. She seemed to be near him in the darkness. At moments, he seemed to feel her voice touch his ear, her hand touch his. He stood still to listen. Why had he withheld life from her? He felt that he had been outcast from life's feast, and he did that to himself, you know? And the ending is a bit depressing. He halted under a tree and allowed the rhythm to die away. He could not feel her near him in the darkness, nor her voice touch his ear. He waited for some minutes listening. He could hear nothing. The night was perfectly silent. He listened again. Perfectly silent. He felt that he was alone. And I find the story beautiful in a way because, like, when do we ever connect with people in the darkness? We see darkness as like a scary negative thing, or like a lonely thing. And to connect with somebody, to bond with somebody, and to feel warmth with them, to feel home with them in the darkness, that's a special thing. The next story after that is called IV Day in the Committee Room. And the story has like a political undertone to it that I don't fully understand, so I don't really have anything to say about this story. I hope to search it up and like understand it more in the future. So the next story in this collection is called A Mother. And the story is about a mother named Mrs. Kearney, and she was formerly Miss Devlin before she got married. And she's doing her absolute best to get her daughter Kathleen into like the musical world, like to get her musical success. Mrs. Kearney tries to work with a guy named Mr. Holohan to get Kathleen to perform music in front of an audience, like on stage. They work out a contract, and they work out a contract that says Kathleen will play as an accompanist, like someone who's like a supplementary musician to someone else playing the main tune. And she will do this for 4 grand concerts, and in return receive 8 guineas. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but that's almost 14 Canadian dollars in our time. The thing is, Mr. Holohan comes off as someone who isn't that organized, formal, or like professional. He's like that client who hires like a software developer to make a website and like says all these requirements, like I want this, I want that, but he doesn't like care to like get it on paper. Like it's just like a verbal agreement kind of thing. He's like that, you know. And in contrast, Mrs. Kearney is like a professional, you know, she holds herself professionally, and she wants to sign a contract and do this like formally, you know, like proper. Like she's like a competent project manager. She forgot nothing, and thanks to her, everything that was to be done was done. And basically, as the story goes, the contract doesn't get fulfilled, and there were issues with setting up all 4 concerts, and Mrs. Kearney tries to get her full payment for her daughter. The other party of the contract, though, is a bit fuzzy and unreliable. Mrs. Kearney brings her husband into things, which has an impact and improves things for her because her husband is a male, and Mrs. Kearney would be taken more seriously if she had like a male to support her. She appreciated his abstract value as a male. She was glad that he had suggested coming with her. In the end, I don't think Mrs. Kearney fully gets her end of the contract, and Mr. Holohan and his colleague Mr. Fitzpatrick think that they're in the right for some reason, like as they're fighting back. Also, the story contains delusional artists like Madame Glynn. First part of the concert was very successful, except for Madame Glynn's item. The poor lady sang Killarney as a bodiless, gasping voice, which all the old-fashioned mannerisms of intonation and pronunciation, which she believed lent elegance to her singing. She looked as if she had been resurrected from an old stage wardrobe, and the cheaper parts of the hall made fun of her high wailing notes. I think the story also highlights how it's not necessarily skill that gets you musical recognition, but like one's position in society, or like how you handle yourself in the business side, how well you get along with the people you're working with. But like that sucks for Kathleen and Mrs. Kearney. Like she's trying so hard, and this is so serious to her, and these guys are kind of like just laid back about it. Okay, so it is the next day. I'm refilming this because the audio was bad, but let's get into it. So the next story from where we left off is called Grace, and there's a footnote here that says Grace, in Roman Catholic theology, grace is a gift by God to rational creatures to enable them to obtain eternal life. The story is about a guy who gets super drunk and injures himself, and he causes an inconvenience, and he's getting help, and he's trying to get identified in the beginning. And we learn that this guy's name is Mr. Kernan, and he's a lower class guy based on his accent and his eccentric personality. And having an eccentric personality, like there's a footnote here that says having an eccentric personality is like a Dublin way to make up for being a low life. And it's like a last resort to be accepted in society. There's a guy named Mr. Power who's Mr. Kernan's friend, and he happens to bump into Mr. Kernan as he's having this as he's causing this scene. And you know, Mr. Power is a more put together guy. He works in Dublin Castle, which implies status or something like that. And he bumps into the scene and he helps Mr. Kernan get home. And then we learn about Mrs. Kernan, who regrets marriage 3 weeks into it. I wonder why. And she shortly becomes a mother after that. She shortly decides to become a mother after 3 weeks of marriage. There's also Mr. Cunningham. He's a guy who's in a bad marriage, but he's highly respected. But like, he's had to move 6 times, and his wife constantly pawns the furniture that they have because she's an alcoholic. But yeah, he's well respected amongst his peers, and he's considered an intellectual. So Mr. Cunningham, Mr. Power, and other people, like this guy, Mr. Soprano, and Mr. McCoy, they hold like an intervention from Mr. Kernan. How Mr. Kernan's actions have been pretty sacrilegious lately. These guys are roasting Mr. Kernan, basically. Like, the story refers to Mr. Kernan as like an invalid sometimes. That was a decent young chap, that medical fellow. He said, only for him. Oh, only for him, said Mr. Power. It might have been a case of 7 days without the option of a fine. There's also slang here, which I find interesting. For example, polluthered, which means comprehensively drunk. True bill, enough evidence to go to court. At this point, 11 pages in, I'm anticipating how Mr. Kernan will redeem himself because of the title Grace. Again, grace is a gift by God to rational creatures to enable them to obtain external life. I think part of obtaining external life is to become free of your sins. Like I'm anticipating some Deus Ex Machina type of thing to remove Mr. Kernan's sins and remove like the badness that came with causing a drunken scene, and inconveniencing people. And there's more slang here that intrigued me. For example, Bostoones, Irish for the Irish is Bestoon, and it means blockhead. And then there's Omadhans, which is Irish Amadan, and it means an idiot. And I know I'm butchering these pronunciations probably. There's also this to wash the pot, which means to go to Catholic confession, which I find pretty interesting. So Mr. Power, Mr. Cunningham, and Mr. McCoy, they decide to go to Catholic confession, and they politely urge Mr. Kernan to join them. It's like they're saying, hey, Tom Kernan, you messed up and you need to go to confession, dude. But it'll be humiliating if you go by yourself, so we're gonna go with you. It'll be like a form of like moral support, you know? And just so you don't look pathetic going by yourself. Good friends. So these following pages after that, they cover a discussion about Catholicism categories and religious figures such as Pope Leo XIII, Pius IX, Jesuits, and stuff like that, which blow over my head. I do plan to dive deeper into this later. And I wonder if these pages say anything about Joyce's views on Catholicism, on the Catholic Church, the people who preach it, and the people who practice it. I wonder if, this dialogue reflects any of his opinions. During this conversation, now there's a conversation, And that happens, and I kind of understand why Mrs. Kernan does not like her marriage. It's based on this passage. When Mrs. Kernan came into the room drying her hands, she came into a solemn company. She did not disturb the silence, but leaned over the rail at the foot of the bed. "I once saw John McHale," said Mr. Kernan, "and I'll never forget it as long as I live." He turned towards his wife to be confirmed. "I often told you that?" Mrs. Kernan nodded. Like he expects his wife to be a yes man, a yes woman, and to be silent, is what I took from that. In the end, it seems that the Catholic confession was a grace, like the Deus Ex Machina, that saved Mr. Kernan. He makes a fool and inconvenience of himself in the beginning, and he rights it by simply going to confession. And he gets away with how he behaved completely. Jesus Christ was not a hard taskmaster. He understood our little failings, understood the weakness of our poor fallen nature, understood the temptations of this life. We all had, our failings, but one thing only, he said, he would ask of his hearers, and that was to be straight and manly with God. I wonder if with the story that if Joyce was throwing shots at this religious mechanism of like doing a bunch of bad things and then going to Catholic confession and like erasing it, these perceived wrongs, and yeah, that's the story. Okay, now we get to the last story, which is The Dead, which is the biggest story in this short story collection. It's more of, I don't know, maybe you can pass as a novella. I'm not sure. But let's get into it. So this story is like super famous, like super highly regarded, and it's like the most popular here, I'd say, and it's what makes James Joyce popular. It's one of the things that makes James Joyce popular, and we'll get into it. So the summary to this elaborate story is that there's this guy, Gabe, who goes to a party, and he has a wife named Greta, and after the party, they head home. Gabe tries to set the mood for sex, but Greta starts talking about a former lover, which she never brought up until this point. She starts talking about this former lover from childhood, and like in detail, and Gabe, like the mood for sex kind of like goes away, and Greta falls asleep, and Gabe is just stuck there alone with his thoughts, and he's contemplative. Now we're gonna start from the beginning. It's January 6th. Gabriel Conroy goes into this party with Greta Conroy, and it's some annual dance by Mrs. Morkan. There's a girl named Lily. There's also Miss Kate and Miss Julia. They are sisters, and their eldest sister, Ellen, is deceased. Ellen was actually Gabriel's mother. So Miss Kate and Miss Julia, who are sisters of Ellen, highly regard Gabe. Like they cherish Gabe because of this connection. The party starts off with Gabe having an awkward conversation with a girl named Lily. Gabe tries to make like innocent fun talk with Lily. He tries to like conversate like a friendly guy, like harmless topic kind of thing. We're at a party, we're just chatting. Gabe asks Lily if Lily's still in school. Lily says she's done, and then Gabe says, "Oh then," said Gabriel gaily, "I suppose we'll be going to your wedding one of these fine days with your young man, eh?" And then Lily goes, "The man that is now is only all palaver and what they can get out of you, with great bitterness." And the vibe of the conversation dies there, and he tries to salvage it, play it cool by giving her a coin, and their interaction ends there, but that negativity of it stays with Gabe for a bit. He was still discomposed by the girl's bitter and sudden retort. And then Gabe swings from this negative interaction to negative thoughts about this speech that he's planning to recite at this social gathering. He worries that he'll come off like a smartass and that he's just flexing his education, his superior education, for he feared they would be above the heads of his hearers. They would think that he was airing his superior education. So far this tells me two things about Gabe. Number one, he is an intellectual guy. Like he indulges in big brain content like poetry. He's capable of analyzing this stuff, and he likes it. He genuinely enjoys it. Big brain stuff. Number two, he's also like compassionate and self-aware. Like he cares about how he's perceived by other people. He cares about how he's making people feel, whether he's making them comfortable or uncomfortable. Like he gauges these things in social interaction. He's not just trying to talk about what he wants or fulfilling his social desires. He's someone who wants others to feel good around him. I can't help but like him for that. And maybe he's portrayed like a smartass. Maybe he's portrayed like a smartass, like a fucking angel. Like, oh, Gabe is this like intellectual guy, and he's better than everybody, and everybody's dumb and not self-aware as him. Maybe that gives a vibe to some people, but I can't help but like him. And then there's this line: Greta tells me you're not going to take a cab back to Monkstown tonight. And there's a footnote here that talks about Monkstown, that Gabriel and Greta are able to live in this pleasant, fairly fashionable inhospitable place to the south of the city suggests a certain social achievement which sets them apart from the other guests at the party. Him living in Monkstown makes a statement that he stands out from these people in like socially, like in terms of status and how well they're doing. And then a bit later, he gets stuck in this conversation with Aunt Julia, Aunt Kate, and Greta, talking about Gallishes, which are these things, like small talk and overfixation on something so seemingly mundane and trivial. And Gabe comes off like a mix of confused and annoyed. Like, it's just Gallishes, it's so mundane. Like, why are we talking about this? You know, like, they're at this reunion. It's hard to like reunite people because of busy lives. And out of all the things you can talk about with this precious time this precious and rare time that you have with each other, you decide to talk about something so trivial and uninteresting. And he's stuck in this conversation. Gabriel knitted his brows and said, as if he were slightly angered, "It's nothing very wonderful, but Greta thinks it's very funny because she says the word reminds her of Christy minstrels." Then Aunt Kate changes the subject, and the topic diverts to Lily. And Gabriel, he's genuinely curious about how Lily's doing and like what's going on with her life. And it'd be nice to talk about it for him and finally have a conversation that's favorable for him going on. But the subject gets changed right before he could like initiate that. "There's that Lily. I'm sure I don't know what has come over her lately. She's not the girl she was at all." Gabriel was about to ask his aunt some questions on this point, but she broke off suddenly to gaze after her sister. And I want to say a bit more about Gabe here. This is when I got the impression that he is perceived as responsible and reliable. "It's such a relief," said Aunt Kate to Mrs. Conroy, "that Gabriel is here. I always feel easier in my mind when he's here." Now there are two characters at this point that I should introduce. There is Mr. Brown. He's this guy who tries to stand out. He comes off instead like he's bragging. Like, it's like he's trying way too hard to insert himself into the conversation and get people's attention. It's like that guy, like you're at a party and it's like, he's like that guy at a party and that you hear from like far away, and you hear this guy bragging about like an accomplishment that he had, but the accomplishment is like he got 1 million views on like a TikTok lip singing video, and he's bragging about it, and he's a grown man. He comes off like that guy. Like, it's not a bad thing. He can just be annoying, and he just craves attention, you know? "I'm the man for the ladies," said Mr. Brown, pursing his lips until his mustache bristled, and smiling in all his wrinkles. "You know, Miss Morgan, the reason they are so fond of me is..." He did not finish the sentence. "Well, you see, I'm like the famous Mrs. Cassidy, who is reported to have said..." Yeah, I'm not going to read the rest of this passage. Yeah, again, he's a good guy. He's just annoying at times, you know? Now, the second character is Freddie Malins, who has his demons with alcohol dependency. And at the third paragraph of the story, I feel like it says a lot about him. Besides, they were dreadfully afraid that Freddie Malins might turn up screwed. And when he was like that, it was sometimes very hard to manage him. Freddie Malins always came late. This says a lot. Like, it sets a tone for what Freddie Malins is like. He's not the most responsible, and in the social circle, he's someone who you have to approach with patience, compassion, and understanding, and kind of like babysit and take care of. Because he's not the best at taking care of himself, and he's also not the most self-aware or responsible. So he tells Gabe a story in like an overly enthusiastic tone, but the story is only entertaining for Freddie, and Freddie's basically talking to himself. And then Freddie spots Mr. Brown across the room and walks over to him tipsily and repeats the story. "He's not so bad, is he?" said Aunt Kate to Gabriel. Gabriel's brows were dark, but he raised them quickly and answered, "Oh no, hardly noticeable." You know, Gabe keeping it civil, you know. "And his poor mother made him take the pledge on New Year's Eve." Remember that it's January 6th in the story. Also, poor mother. And Aunt Kate sadly passes on this responsibility to Mr. Brown, frowning and shaking her forefinger in warning to and fro. And Mr. Brown is like, "All right, dude, let's get you some lemonade, buddy." So then Gabe starts listening to a girl named Mary Jane play the piano, and let's hear his thoughts on her performance. He liked music, but the piece she was playing had no melody for him, and he doubted whether it had any melody for the other listeners, though they had begged Mary Jane to play something. And then Gabe and some others start looking at a picture of Ellen, Gabe's deceased mother, and we learn that Gabe has a brother named Constantine. And there's a footnote here that says, for Ellen to have named her son, also Gabe's brother, Constantine, meant that she had high expectations for him, and that she had high expectations for how he would do in life. And Constantine's actually doing well for himself. And we also learned that Ellen, Gabe's mother, opposed Gabe's marriage with Greta because she, she kind of dismissed Greta as like a country girl, which I think means like Gabe's mother thought Greta was like dumb or something, or like naive. And then we also learn that it was Greta who nursed Gabe's mother, Ellen, while Ellen was ill. And that's a weird dynamic to have. So then everybody starts dancing, and Gabe gets paired with Miss Ivers or Miss Ivers, who basically shits on Gabe for writing book reviews for a newspaper that has like political ties to like bad politics. And Gabe cannot say shit because he wanted to say that literature was above politics. But they were friends of many years of standing, and their careers had been parallel. First at the university, and then as teachers. He could not risk a grandiose phrase with her. He continued blinking his eyes and trying to smile, and murmured lamely that he saw nothing political in writing reviews of books. Yeah, like it's a party, they're dancing, Miss Ivers comes off as this explosive, opinionated person, and she's down to make a scene anywhere, and Gabe is just trying to play it cool, like it's not the right place for this. And they were also close in the past, so it's like best to tread lightly, because I think opposing the opinion of someone like that leads to like explosive conversation. And then Miss Ivers switches things up and invites Gabe to the Aran Isles and shits on him when he declines. This guy wants to see France, Belgium, or Germany, and Miss Ivers is like, "And why do you go to France and Belgium," said Miss Ivers, "instead of visiting your own land?" "And haven't you your own language to keep in touch with, Irish?" asked Miss Ivers. Miss Ivers comes off as one of those people who have strong opinions that they impose on others and expect others to have that same opinion, or expect others to like hear them out and be convinced by her. And she's aggressive about it. She keeps pressing Gabe about why he doesn't want to go, and Gabe doesn't answer and tries to cover his irritation. So Gabe's tense from this conversation, let alone everything else that has happened before this, and he vents to Greta about it. Like, "Yeah, Miss Ivers, she wanted me to go on a trip to the west of Ireland, and I said I wouldn't." And Greta, like being supportive and empathetic, says, "Oh, do go, Gabriel," she cried. "I'd love to see Galway again." And they have this interaction. "You can go if you like," said Gabriel coldly. She looked at him for a moment, then turned to Mrs. Malins and said, "There's a nice husband for you, Mrs. Malins." And that's like not the most ideal way to listen to somebody when they're venting to you, to bring somebody else into this private conversation and to like not hear them, instead to make it about yourself and your own desires instead of like hearing them out. So that sucks for Gabe. He probably feels like super alienated at this point because that's his own wife that did that to him. By the way, I do plan to go to Galway sometime. I've only ever visited Dublin for like a few days when I was in Ireland, and I'd love to go to the west of Ireland and see like the Aran Islands, and then go like 2 hours to get like an Airbnb or like a hotel and travel to the cliffs of Moher. Sorry if I'm pronouncing these things wrong, but I'd love to learn a bit of Irish Gaelic as well. Right now, though, I'm teaching myself German, and I'm trying to get from the B levels to the C levels, study for that exam, and that's like my goal for the near future. But after that, I plan to learn Irish Gaelic for sure. Anyway, back to the story. So, but yeah, it is in my future plans though. Like, it's in the works. It just takes time, but it is like a concrete plan. It's not just like a daydream. Anyway. So, after the dance, after Gabe confides in Greta about his interaction with Miss Ivers, Miss Julia performs a song, and Freddie Malins drunkenly and over enthusiastically praises her for it. And then supper happens, and Gabe helps out a lot with setting up, and he lets everybody get their meals first, even seconds, I think, and then before he gets his, and then he says a speech. And look, about this speech, okay? Gabe is a highly intellectual guy. James Joyce, he's also a highly intellectual guy, and I am not a big brain guy at all. I am a meathead. I am a wannabe literature major. I am a literature major in another life, and I'm way better with analysis in this hypothetical other life, but that is not this life. So I have nothing to say about this speech. It blows over my head, and it's something that I'm going to look into later. So I have no further comment on it. So after the speech, they have a toast after it, and the party slowly dies down after, and people start to leave. At the corner of Wine Tavern Street, they met a cab. He was glad of its rattling noise as it saved them from conversation. I feel like that's relatable. I think if you're an introvert, actually I don't know if you have to be an introvert or not to relate to this quote, but I found that pretty funny and relatable. Back home, after this party, Gabe tries to set the mood for sex with Greta, but Greta starts talking in detail about a former lover, Michael Fury, she had in her childhood. And this boy literally died for her. He had like a disease and he like forced himself to like see her and he died because of that. I feel like I'm simplifying this so much because so many things blow over my head. But this is my script and I'm going to continue. So yeah, poor fucking Gabe. Tries to set the mood for sex and his wife starts talking about a former lover that she never brought up in the past before. And then Greta falls asleep and Gabe is just there alone with his thoughts. He did not like to say even to himself that her face was no longer beautiful, but he knew that it was no longer the face for which Michael Fury had braved death. Perhaps she had not told him all the story, and that's like a dangerous thing to think, like a dangerous way of thinking. It's like a dilemma where you're both fucked either way, because not knowing all the details of the story is just going to leave you wondering. Like, you're going to keep wondering and you're going to sit there and the ignorance is going to haunt your brain. But then if you do know the details, you have more to torment yourself over, and you're just going to repeat that over. You have so many details to like repeat in your head over and over whenever you think about this. So again, poor fucking Gabe. Perhaps she had not told him. Yeah, anyway, so, and then there's this quote that I find beautiful, and it's iconic, like it's famous. Better pass boldly into that other world in the full glory of some passion than fade and wither dismally with age. And that is a beautiful fucking quote regarding passion, regarding skills that you're obsessed about. And this is a beautiful story. I think it kind of ends there. To me, it shows how no matter how close we think we are to people, we are ultimately, like, no matter how close we think we are to people, how many years we've spent, how many deep conversations we've had, and moments, like intimate moments we've shared, we are ultimately individuals, and we are alone in some way. Like, there will always be this disconnect to some extent with everybody that we know. We truly are individuals. Another thing is that the way people impact us, it doesn't matter whether they're alive or dead. That doesn't play much of a factor in how much people impact our lives. Like, for example, this book has fucking impacted me to write a fucking script on it, read it over and over, fucking film this. And James Joyce is a diseased author at this point, and it has impacted me like a lot still. And another thing is that about the story is that it's just simply fun to read a story about a guy who goes to a party or a social gathering, and he's like more self-aware, or like he's taking into account how he's perceived and how he makes others feel, as well as his own desires, and he's trying to be like this compassionate, patient guy, but others are just following their own urges and impulses and their own desires, like talking about whatever they want to talk about and just stuck in their own like thoughts and urges, while this guy is like trying to genuinely get to know people and genuinely connect. And I think, I don't know how other people live, how other people experience social gatherings and stuff, but I don't think we're able to truly appreciate the dead until we are Gabriel in our own in our social gatherings, or at least like we feel that way. So that's just my personal take. And yeah, this is all I have to say about this story. This is truly a great fucking short story collection, man. And it's awesome that it's just one book out of all of James Joyce's literary works. For example, like the first book I've ever read from him was when I was like 5 years ago, or 21, was Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And that book it shaped like the way I thought about life in my 20s. Like, it was basically, like up to now, it was basically like an affirmation that, hey, it's okay to think hard about life. You're not overthinking. Like, there's a difference between overthinking and being super thoughtful and calculated. And when you're super thoughtful and calculated, and you like to do hard thinking, I feel like it adds, you're so much more deliberate with your time and like what you choose to spend it on. as opposed to just going with the flow. Whatever comes at you, you just go with it, and you can kind of just like going any direction life takes you. But like if you're, but if you like think hard, and yes, you're prone to overthinking and being anxious, which is just part of it's a challenge that comes with it. It pays off. You're more deliberate, and I feel like any path you take comes with challenges and problems and downsides, and I'd rather be an overthinker. Like, I'd rather have the problem of overthinking than just letting things pass by and not doing anything. I'd rather have the problem of being an overthinker than being someone who just lets things happen to them and doesn't make their own decisions. And then you look back and you're like did those decisions that I make really come from my own judgment, or was it because I was just going with the flow? I do not want that. I'd rather be an overthinker. Like, oh my God, I overanalyze everything. I'd rather have that issue. And I think that's why I like James Joyce. He's so ruthless towards going for the truth and going for what the real desire is, and it's hard to explain. Like, he's so ruthless with finding the meaning behind actions and trying to like really analyze like why people do like really trying to analyze what the right thing is, and having solid reasons for why he does the things he does. Anyway, this is all my take. I am now going to upload this, and I'm going to dive deeper into these short stories and James Joyce's life in general, and like Dublin culture during his time, and all these things I need to learn to understand this book further. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you for watching this. I'm sure I'm not the only person that this book has really impacted, maybe in different ways. And again, thank you for your time, and thank you for watching.